Good morning. I have a story to tell you. I was homeschooled as a child, and back in the 1990s, homeschooling was still a little weird. Not everybody knew it was legal. And I remember talking about homeschooling to some other kids who went to public school, and they were quite shocked. And one girl, who was probably about 10 years old, said, "Wow, your mom must really love you a lot." And I think she was really startled that a mom would want to spend that much time with her children. And my mom was willing to do that for me and my sisters. So we grew up in Northern California, where our social circle was a lot of homeschool families who the parents had been hippies, and then they became Christians, but they rejected a lot of things. Public school, but like traditional medicine, social security numbers, academics that didn't seem relevant. And my family was never really extreme, but we did wear some of those stereotypical denim jumpers that we hear about. So when I was growing up, I read my mom's books on education, because I was one of those homeschool kids, who reads all the books. So I read books on unschooling, and I read Douglas Wilson's book on classical education. And then when I went to Lutheran college, I read more about classical education, and it really resonated with me. And I became very interested in the history of education and teaching. So when I graduated, I taught in a mainstream Lutheran parish school, and I also taught at a classical school at Emmanuel in Virginia. And now I'm homeschooling my kids. I have an 8-year-old, 6-year-old, 4-year-old, 2-year-old, and a baby on the way. And homeschooling is really a wonderful opportunity to devote your time, your day, your life to educating your children. It really is a blessing. But anything countercultural, whether it's homeschooling or classical education in general, it can be a little bit like kind of feeling our way in the dark. We're kind of asking, well, what does this really look like in practice? What should my day actually be like? And, how do I cultivate virtue when I see every sibling quarrel and every shirt chore? And how do I create a love for and deep knowledge of subjects that I might not know well myself? How do I teach Latin when the baby's breastfeeding and the toddler's potty training? And ultimately, how do I know that I'm doing it right? How do I know I'm doing enough? And homeschooling can be hard and can have some disadvantages compared to a parish school, but it does really have unique strengths. And if we're willing to shake up our picture of what a good education should look like, these unique strengths of homeschooling can help us find the answers to this kind of question. So today I'd like to talk about 4 strengths of homeschooling that fit beautifully with 4 principles of classical historic education. So for me and my husband, the first strength of homeschooling is that it gives us a huge opportunity to shape and guide our children. By and large, we control their environment. We know what they're being taught, and we know how they're behaving. And this strength, it really dovetails with the historic principle of education, the idea that education is not just academics. It's about guiding a human being to love what is good and to develop the habits of virtue that will let them be of service to their family, their neighbors, their community. And of course, trying to guide our children in virtue is something every good parent does. But as homeschoolers, we do have extra time and freedom in this area. But of course, it's a gift that comes with challenges, because when we're with our kids all day long, we see all of their weaknesses in action. And we may well go to bed stressing over those weaknesses and how they are impacting spelling lessons. And meanwhile, our kids are seeing all of our sins and our flaws and our weaknesses, and it's very easy to get a case of imposter syndrome. And we're wondering, who am I fooling when I'm talking about, virtue and teaching virtue. So it's helpful, I think, to remember that virtue is not the same thing as perfection. We're not called to make our children perfect. And to remember that our short-term perception as parents is not always a good guide of what we're doing, because this parenting and teaching, it is such a long game. So I find it incredibly helpful to read a lot of older books that involve family life, biographies and memoirs, older fiction. It's not that the past was perfect or some other era in the past was perfect, but it's really useful to know what did parents and teachers in other time periods, other eras expect from children, and how did they train and guide and discipline children. If you haven't read Little Britches by Ralph Moody, that's a really wonderful book. It's his autobiography of growing up as a boy in ranching territory in Colorado in the early 1900s, where it's really pretty wild country. And it really gives a wonderful picture of how his father guided him when he was a headstrong boy who really needed to be taught wisdom. So then, of course, we have to think about how do we, like Ralph's father, actually teach virtue? And what does that look like in the daily life of the homeschool? And I'm only moderately qualified to say anything because I can't, produce a whole bunch of adult children for you that all live super virtuous lives. But all I can do is share what I've learned so far and what's been helpful to my family so far. And first off, I'd say I really appreciate the historical method for teaching children to understand virtue. And you're probably familiar with this, but it's good to restate it. And of course, there's the two-pronged approach. We teach kids to admire and desire virtue by giving them stories of inspiring, virtuous heroes and martyrs. And this part is actually pretty easy because old history books, classic literature for children, all of these books, they're just crammed full of this kind of story of virtue in people's lives. And then the second part is that we are trying to give our children the habits of behaving virtuously. And this part is a lot harder. So it involves paying a lot of attention to our children because we really need to be consistent if we want traits like gratitude or diligence or patience to be habits for them, things they do by default because they become habits. And this can be done in many small ways. We can make sure they have the habit of saying thank you. We can make sure they don't have the habit of complaining about what's for supper. And consistency on our part on this, it really takes a lot of self-discipline. We're growing in virtue as we try to do this. One of the things I really appreciate about homeschooling is that even though I hope my kids learn virtue through the academics we do, we can also use chores and general life to help teach them the virtues they'll need for their academics. And because we're homeschoolers, we have a lot of time for chores and things like that. So I'll tell you a little story in relation to this. It's not that it's particularly brilliant, but I always think concrete examples are helpful. So we decided that one of our children needed to help clean the dishes after dinner, after supper. So we really wanted him to grow in his ability to work diligently, especially if the job wasn't one that he had chosen for himself. It wasn't something that he wanted to do. So we started, and unfortunately, he did not automatically become diligent. So we kept changing the rules and the structure to try to make this work better. So at first, we'd have him help the adult for a while, and then if the job felt like it was really big or went long, it's like, okay, you can go play now. But then, of course, he's always asking, am I done yet? Have I done enough? So he's definitely not taking ownership for this job. So then we decided that he needed to stay and help the adult the whole time. So we'll just work until the job is done. But then we had a new problem. He was chatting with the adult and, not working very fast. He's dawdling and enjoying the social interaction. But he was not doing his share of the work. So we changed the rules again. And this time we said, Mom or Dad are going to look at the dishes and decide how long on this given night we think cleanup will take. And if we think that this job would take a diligent person 20 minutes to do, we will work alongside him for 10 minutes, and then anything that's left is his. He's responsible for completing it. And all of a sudden, the situational motivation was very different. and it actually rewarded diligence. And he's a wonderful dish cleaner now. He really changed. So he works hard, and he even will come in the afternoon and like wash dishes voluntarily that he finds in there just to make it easier in the evening. They'll come in and get things ready. So it's not that we always want to manage our children into good behavior, but we do want to be very aware of what are we actually teaching with our roles as parents and with the way that we've structured things. What kind of habits have we really set up our home and our academics and our chores to teach. So let's look at another strength of homeschooling. And the second strength is that, by its nature, homeschooling requires ordinary parents to learn in order to teach. And this strength helps us apply another principle of historic education. Catholic writer and thinker Stratford Caldecott writes that attention is a reflection of desire. We pay attention to learning when we desire truth. And he says, attentive concentration on that which is sought and desired unites teacher and pupil through the presence of the third, which is the living truth, the content, if you like. The teacher's job is to bring about that relationship, that state of attention, or to be aware of it and nurture it when it arises by loving the child. So in other words, classical education is about a teacher and a student loving truth together. And classically educated students become lifelong learners because they want to know more. And as homeschool educators, we are forced to model this constant learning. And it might not always feel like an advantage. When we're flipping back the math book in front of the kids to figure out, how do we solve this problem again? But if we do that with the right attitude, we're teaching math, but also something much bigger and more important. And we do get better at teaching the things we practice. My mother-in-law homeschooled her kids, and she always said she never understood calculus in high school. It never clicked. But after she taught all the math that comes before calculus, and then she went through calculus several times with her children, she really gets it now. Calculus totally makes sense. And she's good at teaching it. As another example, I have a homeschooling friend who decided years ago that she should read poetry with her young son. So she decided to do this, and when the book of Robert Louis Stevenson poems arrived, she looked at it, and she realized she was not used to the vocabulary or the syntax, the style of poetry. It's kind of like, who decided this is for kids? This is really hard to understand. But she chose to sort of trust the historical tradition and go through these poems with her son. And now when she looks back on them, she and her son have acclimated. They've gotten used to it, and these poems really do feel like totally cute, fun, accessible riches for children. And because the thing is, as classical educators, we're using materials that are universal. We're trying to pass down this cultural heritage of great books, beautiful art, profound music, and true theology. So when we fill our children's education with Narnia, Shakespeare, Rembrandt, Bach, Scripture, the Catechism, this is a huge help to us as parents as well, because these are materials that are for everyone. And you can really approach them at different levels, because they will teach and nurture children and undereducated adults just as much as they teach and nurture scholars. And they'll help our kids grow, and they'll help us grow as well. And of course, as homeschoolers, we can outsource when we need to. I'm going to be trading some tutoring, writing tutoring with another mom. There are co-ops. When my sisters and I were in high school, we took classes at the community college, which was really beneficial. We got some higher math. We got to kind of sample college life. So there are a lot of options for us. And the third strength of homeschooling that I want to talk about is that homeschooling is a culture. It's really a family lifestyle. And this helps us with our third principle of classical education, the idea that true education requires leisure. And sometimes you hear people talk about it as schole. And for me, it's helpful to compare it to the modern concept of deep work, popularized by writers like Cal Newport, if you've heard of him. His idea is that modern life, modern professional life, it's so full of constant stress and distractions and expectations of multitasking. It keeps us all feeling very busy, but it keeps our brains stuck in the shallows. We really don't have the chance to settle down into deep, focused work. And I think the way we do school in the modern era can do the same thing to children and their brains. But I think that perhaps some of the rising anxiety levels we have culturally have to do with this constant, shallow busyness. Well, the classical demand for leisure is a solution to this. It recognizes that we truly need peaceful, focused time to learn and ponder and contemplate. And the classical idea goes even farther. It tells us that learning requires humility. It takes a lot of humility to stop examining our own productivity and our own rage and our checklists and forget ourselves in contemplating truth and knowledge. And this kind of leisure really is a lifestyle. And focused, self-forgetful learning, it does require structure and hard work, but it's naturally rewarding, like being good at anything tends to be fun. It makes us want to come back for more. And our students need this leisure, and we do too, as their models and their teachers. So then we have, of course, the real-life question of how do we get this leisure? How can we make enough time in the day so that we can actually study things deeply and then go off and think about them? And of course, two different extremes are our enemy here. We don't want to be avoiding stress so much we never make our kids do anything they don't want to do. And we don't want to just cram life full of tasks either. So we really need to think through how we use our time and what we want to spend our time on. And at first glance, as homeschool moms, homeschool families, we might seem to be more pinched for time than the classroom teacher. Because nobody's asking that teacher to nurse the baby and potty train the toddler in class, or keep the laundry running and make sure there's dinner at the end of the day. But the truth is that all the classrooms I've seen have at least as many distractions as your home. Because a room full of kids is naturally distracting. There are the kids who want to socialize, and the kids who are discipline problems. There's the kid who forgot all his supplies, and there's the kid who's crying because their friend hurt her feelings. And there's the kid who's doing his homework secretly in his lab under his desk, probably incorrectly. And that doesn't even get into all the time that's spent in schools, waiting for people to line up for drinks, for bathroom, for lunch, and all those things. So overall, homeschooling is usually more efficient. You don't have lines. But more significantly, we can more radically rethink our use of time in education. So I want to suggest a few ways that we can use our time well. The first two involve borrowing from classroom teachers, and then the rest of them involve being less like a classroom teacher. So first off, we do want to do the homeschool version of lesson planning. I find when I prepare lessons and I write down our schedule in a very orderly way, I can get through so much more with my children. We can much more boom, boom, boom. And when I don't plan as well, there are pauses. I have to look for supplies or check, okay, how many math problems do I really want to make you do today? And it's not just the pause itself, but it's the way I lose the kids. Because, there's a pause and their brain goes somewhere else. They're thinking about the game they're going to play next. They're getting in a goofy mood or whatever, and it's really hard to reel them back in once that happens. And secondly, we can be organized about our students' behavior. When I was a classroom teacher, I always knew we wouldn't get through as much academic material in the first week because we'd be teaching the procedures and the routines. I'd be teaching them how do you prepare this piece of paper for the spelling test, how do you ask to use the bathroom. I'd be establishing if I say, okay, everybody work quietly, you actually do have to work quietly. And as homeschool parents, we can do the same thing. We can think through how we want our kids to treat school time. and be prepared with procedures. Do we want them to keep their supplies in a certain place and follow the system? What subjects will require the table and a good posture? And which subjects will we let them do on the couch or the backyard swing? Do we want our older kids to take turns watching the toddler? And how do we want to do that? What supplies we're going to have in place for that? Do we have a system for telling the kids school's going to start soon, get your drink now, use the bathroom now, so we can be organized? And if we do put in this investment into having structure, it really does save us a lot of time, even though we do just have 2 children here in our home. And this applies to the toddlers and the preschoolers as well. When we start our homeschool year, I always plan to spend extra time helping the younger kids adjust. Some of this is just teaching them rules, like don't disrupt lessons, and following through with consequences if they need it. But it's also giving them, on purpose, special attention throughout the day, so they learn we're taking turns. I still love you, and we have this new routine going. And sometimes it's about figuring out what the little ones need, so they really can succeed. I had a child who, for a while, he really needed a brisk walk every morning before we did school, so that he could play quietly while I did school with bigger kids. So let's shift into ways that homeschoolers can really embrace the idea that homeschooling is a lifestyle and not a class. Of course, when you work one-on-one with a child, you can cover a lot really quickly. So I definitely believe that, especially with young children, 5 to 15 minutes of total concentration on math or phonics is much more valuable than a long lesson. And 2, we can remember that worksheets are a modern invention. And throughout history, students did a huge amount of work orally. If you read old books, they always refer to the teacher hearing the student's lesson. They go study and then they recite. I always find it helpful to look at the way the one-room schoolhouses function in the little house books. The teachers didn't take home grading and the students didn't take home homework, but people really knew a lot, and they were able to recite and tell a lot. So if we do a lot of assessment and teaching through oral questions or through narration, we'll save a lot of time and paper, but we'll also let young children work at a much higher level of thought with a much more complex vocabulary than they can give you with a pencil on paper. And I think we do train students to think on the spot and pay attention more, because they're not going to get a piece of paper with all the instructions and a copy of the thing afterwards. And we're on now. And the third thing I have here is we should remember that you can't teach everything but in classical all the time. You may have heard about the guy who figured that if 1 Tylenol would help her feel better, the whole bottle must be really great. And sometimes I think we do that in education, both in the secular public school system and sometimes in classical schools too. Somebody realizes kids should know this thing. So a book is made or a program is made. But we don't stop there. We keep taking it younger and younger into ages where it might not have historically been taught. We create tons of workbooks, and kids spend a ton of time on this thing, maybe never mastering it, but a lot of time. And there are a lot of subjects that we can teach efficiently if we wait until the kid is ready, and then we do a very intensive, focused study of that thing. So I think it really is better to do fewer things well than to be trying to teach all of the things all the time, because they're so shiny and exciting, and maybe not doing it very well. And 4, we can make a lot of subjects part of our non-school life. We can buy online art lessons and do them for fun in the afternoon. We can teach hymns before bed, and here we're teaching music, and bake cookies with the little ones, and double the recipe or have them have the recipe. We're teaching math. We do geography games in the car or on road trips. When we go on nature hikes, we can really practice paying close attention to the things we see and asking questions, thinking about, what does this mean, these things we're seeing. I think the key to make this really work is you think about what things kids need to know, and think about which things can you, with your natural strengths and knowledge, make happen organically as part of your lifestyle. And I think it is a lot easier to do that with things that you love already, you're excited about, because you will be able to bring them up naturally in life. And 5, I think very importantly, we do need to make sure our kids have a lot of unstructured time in their lives. Make sure they're bored, so they have time where they can read, think, and explore nature, because this is how they learn to contemplate. So the 4th and last strength of homeschooling that I'm going to talk about today is a little different from the others. Homeschooling is risky. When I was a kid, there were a lot of parents in our conservative Christian circles who thought of it as a guarantee. They were going to homeschool their kids, keep them safe from the world, and therefore all of their children would turn out according to their vision of what a Christian should be. But it didn't work out like that for everyone. To homeschool is to take on a risk, because we're all fallible human beings. And if we take on responsibilities for our children's education that would be diffused among a lot of adults in other situations, that does mean we're willing to take on blame if things don't go well. And I think this acceptance of risk, this acceptance of taking authority over our children's education is actually a strength, and it helps us deal with the 4th principle of historic education. Because historically, Western educators have claimed to have authority. And our culture has a weird relationship with authority. And we think as a culture, if you claim to know the truth, you're claiming authority over people, you're making a bid for power. And we treat power as this desirable, scarce resource, but also at the same time, anybody with power might be an oppressor, especially if they make any mistakes. So authority is very uncomfortable to modern Americans. And we really don't know how to deal with it when authorities like police or teachers or parents make mistakes or do wrong things or have bad luck. I think a lot of people's reluctance to take on authority has something to do with the falling birth rate. And who wants to be a parent when your kids might turn around and say, well, you failed me, you messed me up. And I think we see this a lot in how Americans raise their children and educate their children. They're being unwilling to take on their proper moral authority over children. But classical educators are willing to take being authorities. They're willing to take a stand on what kids should learn, and take a stand on what's true versus what's false, what's good versus what's evil, even what's beautiful versus what's ugly. This is really very liberating. But we do it from a different understanding of authority, because we're not seizing power for ourselves. We're following in the footsteps of others in this long tradition of thought and education. But even more, we are under authority. Even if we fail, there is hope, because there is a greater authority. We have a good, merciful God who is working through us and can work through our failings and our weaknesses. And we're doing this because we're fulfilling our vocations, the vocations God has given us. And we're responsible to Him. So our job is not necessarily to succeed or to do enough or to get it right, but our job is to be faithful. And I think sometimes the scariness of that risk of homeschooling and taking on so much responsibility can help us remember this. So I talked about 4 different strengths of homeschooling and how they help us apply these principles. I'd like to say one more thing about homeschooling, as we think about what should it really look like in our homes and in our daily lives. And we can get caught up in curriculum and activities and things like that. But in my life, the families that I knew as a child and people I see today, I've really seen 2 types of homeschoolers. The first kind is living counterculturally because they're pursuing what is good. Their lives are centered on rejoicing in the truth, and they're eager to share this with others. And the second kind is living counterculturally because they're fleeing what is bad. and there tends to be a lot of fear, negativity, feeling superior to the rest of the world. And because we're humans, it's easier than we might think to slip into the second category. And that's yet another reason, I think, to appreciate this tradition of historic education that we have. Because by giving us this rich tradition of pursuing goodness and truth and beauty, it gives us something to preserve and delight in and share with our children and with others, and to thank God for. And it really is a wonderful gift to us and to our children. So that is what I had to say today about applying these principles to homeschooling. So now we have a chance for questions or comments. If people want to share something they found really helpful.
When you talk about doing few things well, how exactly does that look practically? Does it look like semester, by month? Like, this month we're doing math, or this month, or this fall, or this November is an election, so we're going to do this quarter on social studies. Like, how does that work best in your home?
Right. I think it is very home dependent. It does depend on the family and the style. I think for me, I try to keep the formal school part quite brief. We're doing math, we're doing reading, we're doing the things that the kids really need me for. And then I try to make a lot of those things, like learning about the election, just part of our lifestyle. We get books out from the library, and this is something the kids are doing on their own time. They're reading those books, and we have conversation at the table. We talk about it. And the way I tend to choose to do it is not worry about teaching all the subjects to very young children, like science for young kids. It doesn't have to be a textbook. We're preparing them for real science by giving them some sense of concepts, teaching them to observe the natural world, being really interested in the natural world. Maybe they hear terms that they can use later, but a lot of this can be quite organic and part of our lifestyle. I don't know if that answers the question. Yes.
Can some of those same benefits be granted also in a brick and mortar? So what can you learn from this homeschooling organic that you could say is so good that maybe teachers in a brick and mortar should implement? Give me thoughts on that.
Right. I think there will depend a lot of parent buy-in. So you're going to have to educate parents that you're suddenly going to do something very differently. I do think that a school could look at what they teach when and see if there are things that can be trimmed out so that there can be time to do activities. But activities are difficult in a school, in a large group. But I think you could do things like take the kids out for walks in the woods. I think you can do things like involve the children in the church music. And this doesn't have to be something where you're lecturing them or giving them worksheets, but where they're just part of this real life thing. And it's such a good thing, and they're surrounded by adults who think this is a wonderful thing. Children, we're going to learn this hymn, and let's work on these notes together that it can feel like an organic engagement with those rich materials. Or you go out into nature with the children. And again, it's that same thing of the adults functioning as models who are really helping the kids engage with what they're seeing in nature there. It's a very good question.
Thank you.